The Midnight Garden's Bloom. A peaceful moonlight bedtime story. The world had always felt too bright for Mira. Not in the way that sunlight hurts sensitive eyes, though there was some of that too, but bright in the way of exposure, of being seen when you are not quite ready to be looked at. Bright in the way that demands performance, conversation, the small theater of daytime existence. At 34, Myra had learned to navigate the daylight hours with a kind of competent invisibility. She worked at the town library, a job that suited her need for quiet and order. She smiled politely at patrons. She recommended books with genuine warmth. She existed functionally and pleasantly in the world that operated between sunrise and sunset, but she had never truly felt at home there. The cottage had been an inheritance from an aunt she barely remembered, a woman who had also lived alone, who had also preferred silence to chatter. It sat at the edge of a small coastal town in Northern California, where the fog rolled in like a breathing creature, and the sound of the ocean was a constant, low murmur beneath everything else. Myra had moved in 3 months ago, leaving behind a cramped apartment in a larger city, leaving behind the accumulated weight of trying to be someone she was not. The cottage itself was small and weathered, its shingles silvered by salt air, its windows facing west toward the water. Inside, everything was simple. A bed with white linens, a kitchen with open shelves, a reading chair positioned to catch the last of the afternoon light. Myra had brought very little with her, books mostly, and a few pieces of clothing in soft, neutral colors. She was learning slowly that she did not need much, that the space around her could be as quiet as she wished it to be. It was on a night in early June, when the air had finally lost its spring chill and taken on the silken quality of summer, that Myra discovered the garden gate. She had been restless that evening, unable to settle into her book, aware of a strange energy humming just beneath her skin, the kind of feeling that makes you want to move, to step outside, to let the night air touch your face. She had pulled on a cardigan pale gray, soft as a whisper, and stepped out her back door into the darkness. The moon was 3 days past full, still generous with its light. It painted everything in shades of silver and shadow, transforming the ordinary into something otherworldly. Myra walked along the side of her cottage, her bare feet cool against the earth, and that was when she saw it. A section of the fence she had assumed was solid wall was, in fact, a gate. Wrought iron, intricate with scrollwork, so thoroughly covered in ivy and climbing jasmine that it had been invisible in daylight. But now, in the moonlight, the metal caught the glow and traced itself against the darkness in lines of pewter and black. Myra's heart did something peculiar in her chest. A small leap, a flutter of recognition, though she could not say what she was recognizing. She approached slowly, the way you might approach a deer in the woods, afraid to startle the moment into disappearing. Her fingers found the iron beneath the leaves. It was cool and slightly rough with rust, real and solid under her touch. She pulled at the vines gently, carefully, respecting their growth even as she sought what lay beneath. The gate resisted at first, its hinges long unused, but then gave way with a sound like a sigh, a whisper of old metal, a soft complaint, and then it swung open. Beyond lay a garden, but not the kind of garden one tends in daylight. No bright geraniums or cheerful marigolds. No tidy rows of vegetables or neatly mulched beds. This garden was something else entirely. Even in darkness, Myra could sense its difference. The plants were wild, but not chaotic, grown according to some pattern she did not yet understand. And there, at the center of a small clearing, she saw it, a flower just beginning to open. It was a moonflower, though Mira would not know its name until later. All she knew in that moment was that its petals were the color of cream, of pearls, of the pale underside of a wrist, and they were moving. Actually moving, unfurling in slow motion, like silk scarves caught in an underwater current. She could see it happening, this transformation from closed bud to open bloom, and it was the most extraordinary thing she had witnessed in longer than she could remember. Mira knelt in the grass, not caring that the dew was soaking through her thin pajama pants. She watched, transfixed, as the flower completed its opening. 5 petals, each one perfect, each one luminous in the moonlight. And the scent, the scent was like nothing she had ever encountered. Sweet but not cloying, fresh but not sharp. It smelled the way moonlight would smell if moonlight had a fragrance. She sat there for a long time, watching that single flower. And as she watched, she felt something inside herself respond. Some tight, closed place in her chest seemed to recognize what it was witnessing. Here was something that bloomed in darkness. Here was something that did not need the sun's harsh brightness to be beautiful. Here was proof that hidden things could be exquisite. That was when she felt the soft impact against her nose. Mira startled, her hand flying to her face, and found herself eye to eye with a moth. Not a small moth, but a substantial creature, its body thick and fuzzy, its wings the color of moonlight itself. It had apparently mistaken her face pale in the darkness for another flower, and now it clung to her finger, its tiny feet surprisingly delicate, its antennae waving in what seemed like confused apology. Oh, Myra breathed, and despite everything, despite the strangeness of the night, despite the ache that lived permanently in her chest, she smiled. "Hello there." The moth's wings fluttered. It seemed if a moth could seem anything, slightly embarrassed by its error. It crawled along her finger with careful steps, each foot a pinprick of sensation against her skin, and then launched itself back into the air with all the grace of a small, furry helicopter. It wobbled, righted itself, and landed on the moonflower with considerably more success. Mira watched it there, this clumsy, gentle creature, and felt her smile deepen. There was something profoundly comforting about the moth's lack of elegance, about the way it simply continued on despite its awkward navigation of the world. She stayed in the garden until the moon had moved perceptibly across the sky, until the night had grown deep and cool and still. And when she finally rose, her knees stiff from kneeling, her pajamas damp from dew, she felt different, not transformed exactly, but as if something had shifted, as if a door had opened, just a crack, onto a possibility she had not known existed. The next evening, Mira could barely wait for darkness to fall. She moved through her daylight hours at the library in a state of distracted anticipation. She shelved books without really seeing their titles. She answered questions on autopilot. All she could think about was the garden, waiting behind her cottage like a secret she had been entrusted to keep. When twilight finally began its slow descent, Mira was already home. She had stopped at a garden center on her way, feeling slightly foolish but unable to resist. She had purchased a ceramic watering can, pale blue with a long, elegant spout, a pair of soft canvas gloves, a small hand trowel with a wooden handle, worn smooth by use. The woman at the register had asked what she was planting, and Mira had found herself unable to explain. "Night flowers," she had said finally, and the woman had nodded as if this made perfect sense. Now, as the last of the daylight faded from the sky, Mira filled the watering can at her kitchen sink. The water made a musical sound as it struck the ceramic interior, a liquid chime that seemed to resonate with something in her bones. She carried it carefully, conscious of its weight, of the way the water sloshed gently with each step. The garden gate opened more easily this time, as if it remembered her, as if it welcomed her return. Inside, the transformation had already begun. Where last night she had seen only one moonflower, tonight she could see buds on several plants, all of them beginning the slow process of opening. And there were other flowers, too, ones she had not noticed in her singular focus on that first bloom. Clusters of small white blossoms that she would later learn were evening primrose, a vine with tubular flowers that hung like pale bells, and everywhere, threading through the air like an invisible presence, the scent of jasmine. Night-blooming jasmine, she would discover, reading about it later in one of the library's gardening books. Cestrum nocturnum, a plant that saved all its fragrance for the darkness, that released its perfume only when the sun had gone. The scent was intoxicating, almost impossibly sweet, but with a freshness underneath that kept it from being overwhelming. It smelled like summer nights and distant memories, like things half forgotten and suddenly recalled. Myra set down her watering can and simply breathed. She had not realized how tense she had been holding herself, not just today, but for years, decades, perhaps. She had been clenched tight, closed against the world's bright demands. But here, in this dark garden, with the cool night air on her skin and the scent of jasmine wrapping around her like an embrace, she felt herself begin to soften. She began to tend the garden with a kind of reverence. She had read once that plants respond to gentle touch, to care given with attention and respect. Whether or not it was scientifically true, it felt true in her hands. She watered each plant slowly, watching the soil darken as it absorbed the moisture. She pulled away the dead leaves with careful fingers, making space for new growth. She worked her way along the gravel path that wound through the garden, and with each step, the stones crunched softly beneath her feet, a rhythm as meditative as a heartbeat. The moth, she had started thinking of it as Luna, though she had no idea if it was the same moth or a different one appeared again. This time it landed on her shoulder, its feet barely perceptible through the fabric of her shirt. Mira turned her head slowly and found herself looking at the creature's enormous, liquid eyes. There was something impossibly gentle about those eyes, something that seemed to look at her without judgment, without expectation. "You're a terrible flyer, aren't you?" Myra whispered, and Luna's antennae twitched as if in agreement. The moth stayed with her as she worked, occasionally launching itself into the air to investigate a flower, occasionally landing on Myra's arm or hand, or once on top of her head, which made her laugh out loud, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. As the night deepened, more flowers opened. Myra watched each unfurling with the same fascination she had felt the night before. No two were exactly alike. Some opened quickly, their petals spreading in the space of minutes. Others took their time, revealing themselves slowly, incrementally, as if they wanted to savor every stage of their becoming. Mira understood this. She had spent her life taking her time, opening slowly, if at all. The world had always seemed impatient with this pace. People wanted immediate connection, instant intimacy. They wanted you to bloom on command, to be vibrant and open regardless of the conditions, regardless of whether you felt safe. But here in this garden, slow blooming was not just accepted, it was honored. These flowers could not be rushed. They opened according to their own internal clock, responsive only to darkness and time and some ancient genetic knowing. No amount of forcing would make them bloom in daylight. They simply were not made for it. Neither was she, Mira realized. Neither was she. She stayed in the garden for hours that night, long past the time when reasonable people were asleep. She learned the different textures of the plants, the moonflower's silky petals, the jasmine's slightly waxy leaves, the rough bark of the cereus plant that stood in the garden's farthest corner, still only in bud. She learned the sounds of the garden too, the rustle of leaves in the night breeze, the occasional call of an owl from the trees beyond the fence, the soft hum of insects going about their nocturnal business, and beneath all of it, the constant murmur of the ocean, that low bass note that connected everything to everything else. When Myra finally returned to her cottage, the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, that pre-dawn gray that is neither night nor day. She was exhausted in the most satisfying way, her body pleasantly tired, her mind quiet. She fell into bed still smelling of jasmine and earth, and slept more deeply than she had in years. The days became something to move through. The nights became her real life. Mira developed a routine, though she would not have called it that. Routines felt rigid, obligatory. This was something else. This was ritual. This was devotion. She would come home from the library as the sun began its descent. She would eat something simple, soup, bread, fruit barely tasting it, her mind already in the garden. She would change into soft clothes, comfortable and old, things that did not mind soil or dew. And then she would wait, watching through her window as the light drained from the sky like water from a bathtub, slow and then faster, and then all at once. The moment between day and night became her favorite time, that liminal space when the world held its breath, when the day creatures settled and the night creatures stirred, when everything was hushed and expectant. In that space, Myra felt most herself. Not the daytime Myra who smiled at strangers and made small talk about the weather, but the real Mira, the one who lived beneath the surface, the one who had been waiting her whole life for permission to emerge. In the garden, she learned. She learned which plants needed more water and which preferred to stay dry. She learned that the evening primrose liked to be misted, its petals catching the droplets like tiny diamonds. She bought a spray bottle glass with a brass pump that made a satisfying hiss with each squeeze, and the act of misting became one of her favorite tasks. The water caught the moonlight as it fell, creating momentary rainbows in the darkness, and the plants seemed to sigh with contentment as the moisture settled on their leaves. She learned about the different species of night-blooming flowers, reading about them during her breaks at the library, taking notes in a small journal she kept in her bag. Moonflowers, which she now knew were Ipomea alba, members of the morning glory family who had evolved to do everything their cousins did, but in reverse. Evening primrose, Enothera biennis, whose flowers opened so quickly you could actually watch them pop open if you were patient enough to wait. Night phlox, flowering tobacco, night-blooming water lily, an entire world of plants that had chosen darkness, that had evolved to thrive in conditions others avoided. She felt a kinship with them that bordered on the spiritual. but it was the cereus that fascinated her most. The night-blooming cereus, Selenicerius grandiflorus, queen of the night. It stood in the corner of the garden, a strange and slightly awkward plant, more cactus than flower, its stems thick and ungainly. According to her research, it bloomed only once a year and only for a single night. The flowers, when they came, were supposed to be extraordinary, huge, fragrant, breathtaking. But they required patience. They could not be rushed or coerced. They opened when they were ready, and not a moment before. Mira checked the cereus every night, looking for signs of budding. The plant seemed to be watching her back, holding its secrets close. Not yet, it seemed to say, wait. Be patient. Your time will come. Luna had become a regular companion. Or perhaps it was multiple Lunas. Myra could not tell if it was the same moth each night or a rotating cast of fuzzy visitors. But there was always at least one, bumbling through the garden with endearing clumsiness, mistaking Myra's pale hands for flowers, landing on her head, her shoulder, once memorably on the end of her nose again, causing her to go cross-eyed, trying to look at it. The moths made her laugh, which was gift enough, but they also made her feel less alone. Here were other creatures who belonged to the night, who conducted their important business while the rest of the world slept. Here was proof that the nocturnal world was just as full, just as vital as the daylight one, just quieter, just more selective about who it revealed itself to. As the weeks passed, Myra noticed changes in herself that went beyond her growing expertise with night flowers. She stopped apologizing quite so much. When someone at the library asked her to work a shift she did not want to work, she said no without adding a lengthy explanation. When a well-meaning colleague invited her to a loud, crowded happy hour, she declined without pretending she had other plans. "That's not really my thing," she said simply, and discovered that the world did not end. People nodded and moved on, and she was left in peace. She also stopped trying to fill her daytime hours with forced activity. Previously, she had felt guilty about her quietness, her preference for solitude. She had tried to combat it, to push herself into social situations she found draining, believing that this was what healthy, normal people did. But the garden was teaching her something different. It was teaching her that rest was not laziness, that withdrawal was not weakness, that there was profound value in the pause, in the period of gathering strength before blooming. The night flowers did not apologize for closing during the day. They simply conserved their energy, saving themselves for the time when they could truly shine. Mira began to do the same. Her lunch breaks became sacrosanct periods of silence. She took her sandwich to the small park behind the library and sat alone, watching the patterns of light through the leaves, listening to the wind in the trees. She stopped checking her phone compulsively, stopped filling every quiet moment with noise or distraction. She let herself be still, and in that stillness things began to rise to the surface. Memories she had pushed down, feelings she had dismissed as too much, too intense, too inconvenient. Old hurts that had never properly healed because she had never given them space to be felt. The garden held all of it. On a night in late July, Myra found herself crying as she watered the moonflowers. Not sad crying exactly, though there was sadness in it, but something larger, more complex. A release. She cried for the years she had spent trying to be different than she was. She cried for all the time she had forced herself into bright, loud spaces and pretended to enjoy them. She cried for the loneliness that came from never quite feeling like she fit anywhere. and as she cried, the jasmine scent seemed to intensify, wrapping around her like invisible arms. Luna landed on her wet cheek, her tiny feet tickling the skin, her wings brushing away a tear. And Mira laughed through her crying, this absurd mixture of grief and joy, and felt something inside her shift and settle into a new configuration. The garden was teaching her that some things only bloom in darkness, but it was also teaching her that blooming in darkness is still blooming. That beauty witnessed by only yourself is still beauty, that you do not need an audience to justify your existence. August arrived with warm nights and a sky thick with stars. Mira had been checking the Sirius every evening, and tonight, finally, she saw it. A bud, not just any bud, but a large one swelling with promise, its form already suggesting the flower it would become. Her heart leapt. According to her research, once a Sirius showed a bud of this size, blooming was imminent. Perhaps a week, perhaps less. She felt a flutter of anticipation that was almost anxiety. The Sirius bloomed only once a year, and only for one night. If she missed it, if she fell asleep at the wrong time, if she was called away, if she simply did not pay close enough attention, it would be gone. The flower would open, reach its peak, and close again, all in the space of a few hours. A year of growth for a single night of glory. The thought filled her with something like panic. What if she was not worthy of witnessing it? What if she failed to appreciate it fully? What if? But then she stopped herself. This was old thinking. This was the voice that told her she had to earn beauty, had to deserve joy, had to somehow be good enough before she was allowed to receive grace. The Sirius was not blooming for her. It was blooming for itself, and she was simply lucky enough to be nearby if she chose to watch. The distinction mattered. She tended the Sirius with special care over the next few days, though she was careful not to fuss over it too much. Plants, like people, could be overwhelmed by too much attention. She watered it when the soil felt dry. She misted it gently, and she watched the buds swell day by day, or rather, night by night, growing larger, more pronounced, more clearly on the edge of transformation. Luna seemed to sense something special was coming. She and Myra had started thinking of the moth as though she had no idea if this was accurate, stayed close to the Sirius, landing on the plant as thick stems, her antennae quivering as if she could sense the flower's intentions. On the night of August 12th, Myra knew there was something different in the air, a quality of expectancy that made her skin prickle with awareness. The bud had changed. Its outer layers were beginning to separate, revealing the tightly furled petals beneath. It would be tonight. She was certain of it. She prepared carefully, as if for a ceremony. She made herself a cup of key chamomile with honey and brought it to the garden in her favorite mug, the one with the thin crack along the rim that her finger had learned to avoid. She spread a blanket on the gravel path near the Sirius, arranging cushions so she could sit comfortably for what might be a long vigil. She lit a lantern not for light, as the moon was bright enough, but for the comfort of its warm glow, for the ritual of it. And then she sat and she waited. Waiting, Myra had learned, was its own kind of art, not the frustrated waiting of a delayed flight or a long grocery line, but this kind of waiting, intentional, present, the kind of waiting that is actually a form of attention, of devotion, of deep respect for processes that cannot be rushed. The garden settled into its nighttime rhythms around her. The evening primrose had already opened, their pale yellow blooms catching the moonlight. The jasmine was in full force tonight, its scent so intense it was almost visible, a presence rather than just a smell. The moonflowers, old friends now, had unfurled right on schedule, their cream-colored petals luminous and perfect. But the Sirius was the queen tonight, and everyone in the garden seemed to know it. Myra watched. She sipped her tea slowly, letting it cool in the night air, letting each sip be savored. She watched the way the moonlight moved across the Sirius bud as the moon traveled its arc across the sky. She watched Luna and her companions circling, waiting, their fuzzy bodies like small airborne clouds. And slowly, the Sirius began to open. It was nothing like the quick pop of the evening primrose, or even the languid unfurling of the moonflowers. This was something else entirely. This was a revelation in slow motion, a striptease of the soul. The outer layers peeled back gradually, each movement almost imperceptible. And yet when Myra blinked and looked again, she could see that yes, it had changed, it was opening, it was happening. She barely breathed, afraid to disturb the moment. The petals emerged layer by layer, each one impossibly delicate, edged in a pale gold that seemed to generate its own light. They were huge, these petals, easily as long as her hand, and there were dozens of them, overlapping and spiraling outward in a pattern so complex it seemed impossible that it could exist without conscious design. And the center was extraordinary. Stamens burst forth like fireworks frozen in time, golden and intricate, dusted with pollen that caught the moonlight like glitter. The whole flower seemed to pulse with life, with intention, with the pure fact of its own existence. But it was the scent that undid her. Myra had read that the Sirius had a powerful fragrance, but reading about it had not prepared her for the reality. It hit her all at once as the flower reached its full opening ascent, so rich, so layered, so unutterably perfect that she gasped out loud. It was vanilla and honey and something wilder, something almost animal, something that spoke to parts of her brain that existed before language. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and yet somehow exactly right, as if her body had been waiting her whole life to smell this specific combination of molecules. Tears ran down her face, unchecked and unashamed. She was not crying from sadness. She was crying from recognition, because in this flower, in its solitary blooming, in its refusal to perform except on its own terms, in its brief and perfect existence, she saw herself. Or rather, she saw who she could be. If she allowed it, here was a flower that had waited, that had taken its time, that had grown in secret and darkness, with no one watching or caring or even knowing it existed. It had not apologized for its long preparation. It had not tried to bloom before it was ready. It had simply grown quietly and persistently until the moment was right. And now look at it. Look at this astonishing, breathtaking, utterly magnificent flower. This was what happened when you honored your own timing. This was what happened when you gave yourself permission to bloom in private, in darkness, according to your own internal rhythms rather than the world's demands. Myra understood, in a way that went deeper than thought, that she did not need anyone else to witness her blooming for it to be real. She did not need validation or applause or recognition. The Sirius was not blooming for an audience. It was blooming because that was what it did, because that was its nature, because some ancient imperative coded into its cells told it that now, this moment, was its time. And she could do the same. She could grow in private. She could take her time. She could refuse to perform her becoming for anyone else's benefit. She could be strange and ungainly in her growth, like the Sirius's awkward stems. She could wait years between bloomings if that was what she needed. And when she did bloom, if she did bloom, it could be brief and beautiful and entirely for herself. This was enough. She was enough. Luna landed on Myra's knee, her wings spread wide, as if in celebration or agreement. Mira looked at the moth, at this clumsy, gentle creature, who was also exactly what she was meant to be, and she smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not sure who she was thanking. The garden, the Sirius, Luna, the universe. Herself, perhaps, for having the courage to keep showing up, night after night, to tend this secret place. She stayed with the Sirius until the sky began to lighten in the east, until the flower, having given its one perfect night, began the process of closing again. She watched it fold in on itself, the petals drawing back together, the whole massive bloom collapsing into something small and spent. By tomorrow night it would be gone completely, just a wilted memory on the stem. But it had been. It had opened and been perfect, and that could never be taken away. As dawn approached, Mira gathered her things. The other night flowers were closing too, the moonflowers curling their petals inward, the jasmine quieting its scent, the evening primrose retreating until the next darkness. The garden was settling into its daytime sleep, and she needed to do the same. But as she stood, Luna still perched on her hand, Mira felt different. Not transformed exactly. She was still herself, still quiet, still someone who preferred darkness to light, still someone who needed time and space and silence to truly exist. But she was herself without apology now, herself without shame. She walked back through the gate, through her small yard, into her cottage. The space welcomed her like an embrace, simple, quiet, exactly right for who she was. She placed Luna gently on the windowsill, where the moth immediately settled in for her own daytime rest, wings folded, antennae tucked. Mira watched her for a moment, this companion who had somehow become a friend, and felt a swell of affection so pure it made her chest ache. She climbed into bed, still smelling of jasmine and earth, and that indescribable scent of the Sirius that seemed to have embedded itself into her skin, her hair, her very cells. She pulled the white sheets up to her chin and closed her eyes. Outside, the world was waking up. Cars would soon fill the streets. People would rush to work, to obligations, to the thousand demands of daylight living. The sun would rise harsh and bright, and most people would never know that in a small garden behind a weathered cottage, something miraculous had happened in the dark. But Mira knew, and that was enough. She drifted toward sleep, her body heavy with the pleasant exhaustion of a night well spent. Her mind was quiet in a way it had not been in years, not empty but calm, settled, at peace. The constant low-grade anxiety that had hummed beneath her consciousness for as long as she could remember had finally gone still. In the space between waking and sleeping, Myra made a promise to herself. She would keep tending the garden. She would keep showing up in the darkness, night after night, for as long as she was able. But she would also be gentler with her daylight self, the one who had to navigate the bright world. That self was doing her best. That self deserved compassion too. And perhaps she would stop seeing her two selves as separate. Perhaps they were both part of the same plant, the same being. The roots that grew in darkness and the occasional bloom that emerged into light. Both necessary, both real, both worthy of care. She thought of the Sirius, already closing, already returning to its quiet existence. It would spend the next year growing, preparing, gathering strength. And then, if the conditions were right, if it felt safe and nourished and ready, it would bloom again. One night of glory. One perfect expression of everything it was. Mira could be like that, too. Most days she would be quiet, contained, focused on her internal growth. But sometimes when she felt ready, when the time was right, she might allow herself to open fully, to express the beauty that lived inside her, to be seen, briefly, and on her own terms. And if no one was watching, if her blooming happened in the dark, witnessed only by moths and moonlight in her own wondering heart, that was all right. That was more than all right. That was perfect. The thought settled over her like a blanket, warm and comforting. Her breathing slowed. Her body relaxed completely into the mattress. Sleep was rising to meet her like gentle water, and she let herself sink into it without resistance. Her last conscious thought was of the garden, settling into its daytime rest. The flowers closed, the moths sleeping in their hidden places, the soil cool and damp. Everything quiet, everything still, everything exactly as it should be. And in that perfect stillness, Mira slept. When she woke in the late afternoon, sunlight streaming through her windows, she felt the way you feel after a profound dream, slightly disoriented, but fundamentally changed. She lay in bed for a long moment, watching the dust motes dance in the golden light, and realized she was smiling. Tonight she would return to the garden. The Sirius would be closed, retreating into its long waiting, but there would be other flowers, other gentle bloomings, other quiet miracles happening in the dark, and she would be there to witness them, not because she had to, not because it was her job or her obligation, but because she wanted, because she belonged to the night the way some people belong to the sea, or the mountains, or the sky, because in the garden, in the darkness, surrounded by things that bloomed according to their own mysterious timing, she had finally found a place that felt like home. She rose and moved through her evening preparations with a sense of ritual and purpose. Tonight would be different from last night. The Sirius would not bloom again for another year, but it would have its own small perfections. A moonflower unfurling, the scent of jasmine, Luna's clumsy visits, the cool night air on her skin, the sound of gravel beneath her feet. These things were not spectacular in the way the world usually measured spectacle. They would never make headlines or trending topics. They would never be photographed and shared and liked by thousands of strangers. They were quiet things, hidden things, things that happened in darkness, noticed by no one, except they were noticed by her, and her noticing was enough to make them real, to make them matter, to make them worth the showing up night after night after night. As the sun began to set and the sky took on its familiar gradient of orange to pink to purple to indigo, Mira felt the familiar pull toward the garden. She filled her watering can, the water singing its ceramic song. She slipped on her soft shoes, well worn now from her nightly walks on gravel paths. She picked up her misting bottle and her small trowel and headed for the gate. But at the threshold, she paused. She turned back to look at her cottage, at the simple space that held her daylight life. She thought about the library where she worked, the books she shelved, the quiet service she provided. She thought about the grocery store where she shopped, the cafe where she sometimes got tea, the small interactions that made up the visible surface of her existence. Those things were real too. They were part of her, part of the whole picture. She did not have to choose between her daylight self and her nighttime self. They could coexist. They could inform each other. The strength she gathered in the garden could help her navigate the bright world, and the bright world, in turn, could remind her of why the darkness was so precious. She was not two separate beings. She was one person, complex and contradictory and entirely herself, sometimes closed, sometimes open, always growing, always changing, always becoming something she could not yet see. With that thought, she stepped through the gate into her midnight garden, ready for whatever small blooming the night would bring. If this story resonated with you, if you found some peace in these quiet moments, please consider showing your support with a like, and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more restful journeys through the gentle hours of night. May your own blooming, whenever and however it comes, be exactly what you need it to be. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep well.